Get him off my dock." The words cut through the marina like a knife. Every camera turned. Every bidder in the auction tent went quiet. And standing there in a faded work jacket, one hand wrapped around a greasy white rag, Marcus Reed did not move. Across from him, Evelyn Carrington stood beneath the gold-trimmed banner of Carrington Atlantic, the shipping empire her father had built and the world believed she was born to command. Her navy dress was spotless. Her diamond watch caught the harbor light. Behind her, lawyers, captains, brokers, and investors waited for her to finish embarrassing the man who had dared interrupt a $70 million fleet sale. Marcus looks down at the rag in his palm. Dark oil had soaked through the cotton in uneven streaks. Not black, not brown. A strange blue-gray shine ran through it like metal dust under the sun. He had seen that residue only once before, and that memory had cost him everything. Evelyn's voice sharpened. "You are a dock worker. You tie ropes. You move crates. You do not walk into my auction and accuse my company of sabotage." Marcus lifted his eyes. "I didn't accuse your company." A murmur moved through the crowd. Evelyn narrowed her gaze. "Then what exactly are you saying?" Marcus turned the rag toward the fleet behind her. 6 white cargo vessels floated in perfect formation, polished for buyers, flags snapping clean in the wind. The lead ship, the Carrington Mercy, looked flawless from the dock. But Marcus wasn't looking at the paint. He was looking at the thin line of oil bleeding from a service hatch near the stern. "I'm saying one of those ships won't make it out of the harbor," he said quietly. "And somebody here knows why." A man in a silver suit laughed too loudly. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Security." 2 guards stepped forward. Marcus did not resist. He only held up the rag higher, his voice still calm. "If you let that engine start, you won't have an auction. You'll have witnesses." That was when Evelyn saw something change in the faces behind him. Not fear, recognition. One old harbor mechanic near the fuel station had gone pale. A retired captain lowered his bidding paddle. And Evelyn's chief operations officer, Dalton Pierce, stopped smiling. For the first time that morning, Evelyn Carrington looked away from Marcus and toward her own fleet. Because the man she had just called useless was the only person on the dock who seems to understand what was about to happen. Before we go further, remember this. Sometimes the person standing closest to the truth is also the person everyone has trained themselves to ignore. Not because he is wrong, but because his uniform is cheap, his hands are dirty, and his name is not printed on the building. This story is about a man who had no reason to speak up, a woman who had every reason not to listen, and one stain of oil that carried more truth than a room full of polished reports. Stay with this one, because the smallest detail on that dock will decide who loses everything and who finally gets believed. 3 days before the auction, Marcus Reed arrived at Pier 19 before sunrise. He always did. The harbor was still dark at 4:43 a.m., with only the green navigation lights blinking over the water and the low groan of cranes moving containers in the distance. Most men hated that hour. Marcus preferred it. Before the executives arrived, before the brokers and inspectors and photographers filled the marina with polished shoes and expensive cologne, the dock belonged to the workers, men like him. Marcus was 46, though the gray in his beard made strangers guess older. He was broad-shouldered in the way men become when life gives them work instead of rest. His hands were marked with small scars, rope burns, steel nicks, engine heat, the quiet history of fixing things no one thanked him for fixing. At home, 6 blocks inland in a narrow apartment above a closed bait shop, his 12-year-old daughter Naomi would still be asleep under a patched quilt with little yellow stars on it. Before leaving, Marcus had set out her cereal bowl, packed her lunch, and left a note on the refrigerator. "Science fair posters in the hallway. Don't forget it. Proud of you. Dad." Naomi kept every note. Marcus knew because he had once found them tucked in an old shoebox under her bed, stacked like proof that he had tried. He had not always been a dock worker. Years ago, his name had been spoken in rooms with maps, shipping routes, engine schematics, and men who wore suits to hide their fear. Marcus Reed had been a marine systems investigator, the kind of specialist companies called after accidents, fires, breakdowns, and disasters no one wanted connected to negligence. He could read an engine the way some people read a face. A vibration out of rhythm, a smell too sharp, oil that carried the wrong color, a bolt that had been replaced by someone who wanted the part to fail later, not now. That old life ended after the Gulf Meridian incident. A vessel lost power in storm water. People were hurt. One man died. The company needed a name to feed the press, and Marcus had signed the inspection clearance 2 days earlier based on reports later proven to be altered. But by the time the truth surfaced, his reputation had already been dragged across every trade paper from Houston to Norfolk. His wife Claire was alive then. She believed him when almost nobody else did. "You know what you saw," she used to say. "And one day, someone will need you to see it again." But Claire had been gone 4 years now. Ovarian cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. After that, Marcus stopped fighting the past. He left the investigations, left the conferences, left the men who only called when they needed him to save their balance sheets. He took work where no one asked questions. Dock labor paid less, but it was honest. It kept Naomi fed. It kept him near engines and water, even if he no longer put his name on reports. On that Tuesday morning, Marcus was checking mooring lines on Slip C when he first noticed the smell. Not diesel, not old bilge, something chemical underneath hot oil. He stood still. The vessel beside him was the Carrington Mercy, the crown of Carrington Atlantic's mid-size cargo fleet. It was one of 6 ships Evelyn Carrington planned to auction as part of a bold restructuring plan that the business channels had been talking about for weeks. "Old fleet out, clean future in," one headline had said. Marcus didn't watch business channels, but everyone on the dock knew the auction mattered. If the sale went high, Evelyn would silence the board members who said she was too young, too cold, too untested to lead her father's company after his stroke. If it failed, sharks would circle. Marcus stepped closer to the stern. The thin smear had gathered under the service hatch. He took a rag from his back pocket and wiped it once. The oil clung strangely, too smooth at first, then gritty when he rubbed his fingers together through the cloth. In the weak morning light, it flashed with that blue-gray metallic sheen. Marcus's throat tightened. No. He looked up at the Mercy's engine access panel. The seal was clean. Too clean. The screws around it had been touched recently, but not by regular maintenance. A proper mechanic would have seated them evenly. These were tight at the top, slightly off at the bottom. Somebody had opened that panel and wanted it to look like they hadn't. "Reed!" The voice came from behind a stack of orange cargo straps. Dalton Pierce walked toward him with a tablet in one hand and a coffee in the other. Carrington Atlantic's chief operations officer, dressed like a man who wanted workers to know he was above them and executives to think he understood them. His smile was wide but never reached his eyes. "You're on line duty today," Dalton said. "Not inspection." Marcus folded the rag in his hand. "Who serviced the Mercy last night?" Dalton stopped walking. The pause was small. Most people would have missed it. Marcus did not. "Approved crew," Dalton said. "Why?" "There's residue under the stern hatch." Dalton's smile returned, thinner now. "It's a working ship. Ships leak." "Not like this." Dalton stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. In 3 days, this dock will be full of people who write checks bigger than your lifetime wages. Miss Carrington needs clean optics, no rumors, no worker drama, no old men pretending they know more than engineers." Marcus looked at him. "I'm 46. "Then stop acting like a retired ghost." Marcus said nothing. Dalton glanced at the rag. "Throw that away." It was not a suggestion. Marcus slipped the folded cloth into his jacket pocket. Dalton's eyes hardened, but before he could speak again, a black town car rolled through the Marina gate. Everyone on the dock changed posture. Evelyn Carrington had arrived. She stepped out before her driver could open the door fully, already speaking into a phone, already moving fast. She was 38, sharp-eyed, elegant, and surrounded by people who treated her silence as instruction. Her father had built ships from debt and steel. Evelyn had inherited the empire, but not the trust that came with building it. So she performed control like armor. Marcus watched her cross the dock. For one brief second, she looked toward the Carrington Mercy with something almost like worry. Then Dalton moved to her side, smiling, speaking low. Evelyn's eyes shifted, toward Marcus, toward his worn boots, toward the grease on his sleeve. And whatever Dalton said, Marcus could see the judgment settle before she ever opened her mouth. She did not see a warning. She saw an inconvenience. Marcus touched the rag in his pocket and felt the grit of that strange oil through the fabric. Somewhere inside the Mercy, a machine had been marked to fail. And the auction had not even begun. Evelyn stopped in front of him, with Dalton half a step behind her, and two assistants hovering near a rolling rack of garment bags, camera schedules, and printed lot sheets for the auction. Up close, she looked even more controlled than she had from a distance. Not calm, controlled. There was a difference. Calm came from confidence. Control came from never allowing anything unplanned to breathe. Dalton gestured toward Marcus with the casual contempt of a man introducing a stain. "One of the dock hands," he said. "He thinks he found a problem." Evelyn's gaze flicked to Marcus's face, then to his jacket, then to the rag still partly visible in his pocket. "What kind of problem?" she asked. "The kind you'll want checked before the auction," Marcus said. Dalton gave a short laugh. "He wiped oil from a service seam and turned it into a conspiracy." Marcus kept his eyes on Evelyn. "I said it should be checked." Evelyn held out her hand. He looked at it once, then placed the rag in her palm. She unfolded the cloth delicately, like something unpleasant had been passed to her by mistake. The blue-gray sheen caught the light. Her expression did not change, but Marcus noticed she looked at it a fraction longer than he expected. "Can your engineers identify this?" he asked. "They can identify everything on my dock," Dalton said. Evelyn handed the rag to one of her assistants without looking away from Marcus. "And you are?" "Marcus Reed." "Reed," she repeated. "And your role here is?" "Lines, loading, maintenance support when asked." "Then stay with your role." It was not shouted. That somehow made it sharper. Evelyn stepped around him and continued toward the Mercy, as if the conversation had concluded. Dalton lingered only long enough to give Marcus a look that promised trouble before he followed her. Marcus watched them board the vessel with two engineers and a photographer. He knew that type of inspection. Fast, visible, superficial. The kind designed to reassure buyers, not discover inconvenient truths. He turned back to his duties because Naomi's school lunch, rent, and the electric bill all depended on men like him swallowing their pride on schedule. But all morning, the residue stayed in his mind. At 10:15, his phone buzzed. Naomi. He stepped behind a storage container before answering. "Hey, Bug." "Dad, do you still have my blue markers?" Naomi asked. "In the kitchen drawer, next to the takeout menu." A beat of silence, then quieter. "Did you remember the permission slip?" Marcus closed his eyes. "No." "It's okay," she said, too fast, the way children try to rescue adults they love. "I can ask Miss Dorsey for another one." "I'll bring it on lunch." "You don't have to leave work." "I said I'll bring it." He heard her smile through the line. "Okay." "And Dad?" "Yeah?" "You sound like the harbor voice." "The harbor voice?" "The voice you use when something's wrong and you don't want me to hear it."